called Polar Bears International. And what we do is we focus on conserving polar bears and of course on conserving the sea ice, because if you don't have any sea ice, you don't have any polar bears. And that's because polar bears use the sea ice to hunt and to breed and to transport themselves and sometimes to raise their young. And so I've been studying polar bears for the past 15 years. And for the past little more than a year, I've been a staff scientist with Polar Bear International. And I do research, but I also spend a lot of my time talking to journalists and definitely talking to guys like you and just talking about polar bears, answering all the curious questions that people have. And I really love doing that. So let's see. Here, I just want you to know why it is that we talk about polar bears, but also about sea ice. And of course, like I said, it's because sea ice is so important to polar bears. Like they are literally a marine mammal. They spend their entire life on this frozen surface of the sea, if they can, if there is enough sea ice for them to do that. But we also want to conserve the sea ice because it is the basis of the whole ecosystem. So the polar bear is on top of this ecosystem, and the sea ice is really important for the polar bear because a polar bear is a strong swimmer, but it's not fast enough in the water to catch the seals that are its main prey. So if there's no sea ice, the polar bear simply cannot catch the seals. So it's really important for this top predator that we have really good healthy sea ice. However, and something that a lot of people don't necessarily realize, the sea ice is also incredibly important at the bottom of the food chain. Because if you look at this picture, you can see that underneath the sea ice, you actually have algae growing. And that's kind of like, you can say that the sea ice is to the Arctic ecosystem as soil is to the forest, and that the algae kind of sort of is the grass that forms the whole basis of the food chain. So these little algae that grow underneath the sea ice, they are food for tiny little organisms called diatoms that feed the copepods, that feed the Arctic cod, and who eats the Arctic cod, who eats the fish? The seals. And who eats the seal? Polar bears. So if you don't have healthy sea ice, not only will the polar bear not be able to catch the seals, but also you probably don't have a lot of seals because the whole ecosystem would be in trouble. So that's why polar bears need sea ice and the whole Arctic ecosystem needs sea ice in order to be healthy. So that's why we focus not just on polar bears, but on sea ice too. Now I want to show you, just because I just heard where all you guys are from. Oh, actually, hang on. Hi. I didn't mean to stop sharing my screen.
That's okay.
But I want to show you something else here. So can you see my screen?
Yeah, well, perfect.
Yes, you can. So I'm guessing you've all seen this map before of the US. And you all know whereabouts you are. Oh, we had people in California too, is that right?
Yeah, we got a California. We got everywhere
in
today.
order to get everywhere, in order to get to Denmark, where I am, you have to cross the Atlantic and go all the way over here. So this red dot is Denmark. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. It is a very, very tiny country. It's part of Scandinavia. And maybe you've never really heard of us before, but I'm pretty sure you've all heard of Hans Christian Andersen. He wrote all the fairy tales and he was a Dane way back when. But I'm very sure you also all know Lego. So Lego actually was born in Denmark, and it's still where we have the original Lego land. So I encourage all of you to come by and visit that. Now, Denmark is too far south to have polar bears. Yeah, we're down here, and up here you have the North Pole. Now, if we go to the North Pole, see the United States are down here. Denmark is right there. And we have the North Pole up here. You find polar bears all around the high Arctic. Actually, you also find them as far south as Hudson Bay, but those are the very southernmost polar bears that you'll find. Other than that, they're all around the high Arctic. So you'll find polar bears in Greenland, in Canada, in the US, up here in Alaska, all along the coastline of Russia, and then in Svalbard, which are this little group of islands that belong to Norway. So yeah, in order to study polar bears, I didn't just stay in Denmark. I had to travel, so I studied many different places. I went to school, but I also did here field work in many different places. Hang on, there we go. So this is me on the left, and my very good Norwegian friend, Gro, on the right. We are doing field work in East Greenland, and we're all kitted out because we're on a way out with skidoos. However, today I want to focus on some field work that I did in Canada a couple of years ago. And this was way up in the north on this little island called Banks Island, because there are so many different ways that we can learn about polar bears, but field work really is one of the main ones still. So we're going up to this place called Viscount Melville. And when you go that far south, you use helicopters. And you usually use small helicopters because they have to be very nimble, very flexible when you go looking for polar bears. So this is where we were staying. If you look at that little square in the middle of the biggest picture, that is our cabin in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. Yeah, and in the bottom picture, you can see that our helicopter is parked outside of our cabin. And that's, just so we can keep an eye on it, because sometimes you'll have like Arctic wolves will come by and chew on the ropes, or a polar bear will come by and try and like push the windows in just because maybe you could eat something in there. So you really have to have it right outside your cabin so you can keep an eye on it. This is a close-up of the cabin, very luxurious, right? It's very small, and we're 3 people staying in it, myself, my professor, and the helicopter pilot. And we stayed there for a month and a half. So the picture here is me in our dining room area, if you will. Again, very small kitchen. So really every room in there has multiple things that you can do in there. So this is the dining room area with all the dried and canned foods. And then this is the other end of the table. You can see the end of the table in the left bottom corner, and our kitchen that we're looking at. So yeah, very fancy. It was amazing to be up there, and we had delicious food and all that, but it requires a lot of work when you're that far away from home. For example, you can see on the stove, we're melting snow because that was the way to get water. Like there's no running water anywhere. So you have to melt all the snow that you need to cook with, that you need to wash your dishes with, that you need to wash yourself with, and that you need to drink. So that's really something you have to keep in mind. Also, you can see here, this is where we were sleeping. It's also part of this tiny cabin. And then in the bottom right, you can see our fancy bathroom, which, to be honest, is just a bucket. It's also called a honey pot, if any of you have ever heard that. Yeah, so when you're doing field work in the very remote parts of the high Arctic, it can be a little rustic, a little simple. So the reason why we're up there is because we're tracking polar bears, looking for polar bears. And so you go out in the helicopter and you fly over the sea ice, and you're looking for polar bear tracks in the snow on top of the sea ice. And here you see there's this seam that is running between 2 ice floes. And that's a really good place. It's called a lead, like a closed lead. It's a really good place to be looking for polar bears because that's where it's easy for the seals to come up and get a breath of air. And where you find seals is usually where you'll also find polar bears. So then once we found polar bear tracks, we would follow them until we got to a bear. We would sedate the bear from the helicopter and then set the helicopter down. Look at this sedated bear, make sure it was really sedated because you don't want a polar bear that's fully awake while you're right next to it, right? And then we would get to work. And I'll show you a little bit about what kind of work it is. But this is a sedated bear. This is me with the stripy hat and our helicopter pilot also helping out. So one of the things we do when we have a polar bear in hand is we give it an earring or an ear tag, if you will. And that's this little white disc that you see in the picture, the top picture. It's basically it's really just a piece of plastic that's in the ear, like an earring, ear tag. And it has the animal's unique ID number on it. So it's scientific name, you could call it. And this ID number is also tattooed on the inside of the upper lip. You can see that in the bottom picture. And that's because we only do this the first time that we have the bear in hand. Like the first time that scientists meet this bear, we will put the tattoo and the ear tag in the bear so that if we ever catch that bear again, if we ever see this bear again, we will be able to see how its health has changed, in what area we find it, whether it's with cubs or not. We can get to know so many different things about these animals when we see them multiple years. Sometimes we also put satellite collars on them, not always, but sometimes. Actually, let's see. Yeah, so these satellite collars, you can only put them on the females because the males, their necks are just too broad. Like if you put a satellite collar on a male, it's just gonna slide right off again. So we can only put these on the females. And that's why there's actually a new really cool project out there that develops tiny little satellite collars, like tracking devices, that can be put on the ears of the bears. And that means that with these tiny tracking devices, we can also then track the movements of not just adult females, but also of the teenage bears and also of the adult males. And all this satellite information that we get from the collars, we can then use to see how much time are the bears spending on ice. Are there certain areas that they like to be in? How long are they spending on land? When do the females go into their maternity den? When do they come out of the maternity den? We can learn so many details about the bears and how they're using the ice and how they're reacting to changes in the sea ice and, you know, in the climate, how they're reacting to that just from the satellite information that we can get from these colors and from the ear tags. Oh, hang on. Now I have this video, so I'm just going to talk over it, and you can see it's in, what do you call it, fast motion, fast forward. I'm going to show you here. So this is a sedated bear. This is out on the sea ice in Viscount Melville Sound that I showed you. So Patrick, you'll see our pilot. He's standing up there to the left. He will help us, but he'll also be on the lookout for other bears in the area, because you always need to be prepared for another bear to show up, right? And you definitely want to be paying attention to that. Now we're rolling the bear over because we're taking different measurements, like the circumference of the bear and the length of the bear. We're taking so many different kind of tissue samples or biological samples, if you will, but we also take a lot of different measurements so that we know how big are the polar bears in this particular area, for example, because that can tell us a lot about what kind of energy resources they have available, what kind of food they have available. We look at whether they have any scars. A lot of the old males have scars because they've been fighting during mating season for access to the females. We also look at how their teeth are. We take, what do we take? Actually, I'll show you that a little bit. I think it's right after this video. Then you can see there's this black mark on the shoulder hump of the bear. And that's because it's just this fatty marker. That's because when we're out there flying, there's no need to capture the same bear twice. So when we have had a bear in hand, we will mark it, and then we can see it from the air when we go looking for polar bear tracks. And if we see this bear from the air, we'll know that we already had this bear in hand. We already collected information on this bear. That's me asking Patrick to take a picture. And because we already had this bear in hand, we don't want to catch it twice in one field season. Let's see. So these are just some of the samples that we take. It depends a lot on, what kind of projects we're doing at the moment and what polar bears we're looking at and all of this. But of course, we'll look at the sex of the bear. Sometimes we take blood samples. Sometimes we take a little sliver of the claw, like with a potato peeler, an actual potato peeler. We'll do that. We take fat biopsies on the rump of the bear. That's where most polar bears, or all polar bears, have their really large storage of fat is on their rump. So that's where we take samples of that. We take hair samples. I've been working a lot with polar bear hair because you can use it for so many cool things. Then we take the measurements, like the bodily measurements, like head width, head length, length of the bear, circumference, all of these different things. Sometimes we put on the color. Sometimes, if it's the first time that we have an adult bear in hand, we will take this tiny, tiny little tooth. It's right behind the canine, so it's right behind that great big carnivore tooth that looks so impressive. Just behind that, there's a tiny little tooth, and it really serves no function, like it's on its way out evolutionarily, and it's very easy to take out. And then when you take it back to the lab, you can actually cut it in half, kind of, sort of, like a tree stump, and then you can read the rings in the teeth, and that will tell you approximately how old the bear is. Now, again, we only do this with adult bears that we've never met before. Yeah. If we've ever done it, then we have the information in our data bank, and then we don't need to do it again. And if we get like a family group, like a mom with her cubs, we don't need to do it either, because we know by the size of the cubs how old they are. And then we'll put that information in the data bank. Yeah. And sometimes we also take like breath or feces or milk or whatever researchers are looking at. Yeah. So that is one of the ways that we can study polar bears. Now, there are many other ways that we can do it, and we're all trying to move towards less invasive ways of monitoring polar bears, like of keeping track of how they're doing. And that's why especially the hair samples and the fecal samples are incredibly important, because those are samples that you can get without ever having your hands on the polar bear, without ever necessarily seeing the polar bear. So we're moving that way. It's just taking a little while. Yeah, what did I want to say? Yes. So very few people get a chance to actually see polar bears in the wild, right? Because they're so far north and it's such inaccessible areas. So for a lot of people, maybe they never meet live polar bears, or maybe they do so in a zoo. And I want you to know that polar bears in zoos can have a really, really important role when it comes to developing new ways of studying polar bears. And I have this little video that explains to you one of the ways that zoos can help. So I'm just going to play that for you. And I know the sound is weird in the beginning, but it's supposed to be. Can you hear the sound? Yes.
Yes, now we can, yeah.
We get a lot of questions about why Tossel's wearing a collar when she has it on. And it's part of a research project. We're collaborating with a scientist from the US Geological Survey. And he has a lot of questions about how polar bears behave in the wild. It's very difficult to study polar bears. It's actually notoriously difficult and expensive to get to where they are and directly observe their behavior. So what we've had an opportunity to do here at the Oregon Zoo is train Tossel to wear that collar. What he's putting in there is an accelerometer, and that's similar to something you would find in your smartphone. It's how your phone knows when you're turning it upside down or sideways. And so it's responding to very subtle motions on the bear's part, walking, sitting, even sleeping for long periods of time, or running. And then the researcher can actually videotape her wearing the collar and match the signals that he's getting with the behaviors that Tossel's performing. And when he goes and puts a collar on a wild bear, he can interpret those signals and actually analyze what kind of behaviors the polar bear is doing minute to minute. This model is just a training collar. On a wild bear, the researcher would install a quick release mechanism where they can have the collar fall off once they have the data that they need. Now that she's wearing the collar, we were actually able to mount a small camera on the collar itself to really give people a polar bear's eye view. Tossel's really responded well to the training. She's used to spending time with her keepers every morning and learning new behaviors and cooperating with them. And so this was really just one more challenge for her. And she seemed very interested and participated willingly. I think she's a very curious bear. Seems like she is very interested in all the extra attention she's getting from keepers. And if we can help biologists develop some tools to better and more quickly understand what bears are doing and how they're responding to changes, I really think that's one of the roles of a zoo. We want to educate our visitors. We want to get them excited about polar bears. We want them to think about their actions in relation to climate change. But we also want to make sure that these animals, when possible, are contributing to the larger base of knowledge about their species.
Oops. All right. So there you go. Yes. I just want to tell you that, like, even if you never go to the high Arctic and you don't see a polar bear, then you always have the chance to see one in one of the many awesome zoos that exist out there and that are really essential to developing new methods of studying polar bears in the wild. And I think that was all I had. So now I am very ready for all your questions.
Well, fantastic, Thea. Thank you so much. What a fantastic presentation. And I want to note for our classes too, we literally just put this out in a newsletter minutes ago, but on the 27th of February, we are doing a polar bear session from the enclosure with the Toronto Zoo. So if you want to follow up after this and learn more, please do. In addition to our 7 classes live, we've got a bunch of classes from Ontario, Idaho, Ohio, all joining us on YouTube. So if you guys want to type in questions there, please do, and I'll pass along as many as I can. But let's start by going to Miss Rosenberger's class. If you guys want to kick us off with a question, come on up.
Right. Yep. Right, there you go. What color are the polar bear skins?
What color is polar bear skin? It's actually black.
Yeah.
So you can't really see it as long as there's hair on the bear, so to speak, except you can look under the foot pads and you can see around, the nose, around the eyes, and around the lips of the bear. But also sometimes you'll see if there's an old scar on the bear, the hair tends to not necessarily grow back on the scar, and then you can see the black skin there.
Yeah, very cool. Great kicking us off, guys. All right, let's go to North Hollywood, Mr. Penix's class. If you guys have a question, go for it.
Up here. We're gonna just move the screen.
Oh yeah, you're good.
There you go. Right. So look here. That's the question.
How can they hold their breath for a long time?
Yeah.
Can they hold their breath for a long time?
And how can they
Sorry,
hold
my
their breath? Is there
computer's
anything Is there anything specific about them that allows them to hold their breath for as long as they do?
Oh, how can they? Right. So they basically hold their breath the same way that you and I do. I think the difference is because we know that polar bears can hold their breath for a long time, at least 3.5 minutes. The only difference between them and us is that they have really needed to be able to do this. And so, you know, evolution has pushed their ability to be able to hold their breath. As humans, we don't really dive so much. We're not in the water as much as a polar bear on an everyday basis. So we don't need it quite as much. Although humans can, honestly, we can train ourselves to hold our breath for a long time too. So yeah, they don't have a special trick, I guess is the answer.
Perfect. Yeah. All right, let's go to Stafford Springs. Miss Corkum and Miss Erickson's class. Come on up.
How do you get the collars on? They don't look like they have clasps, and you said that they can't fall off.
Yeah, let's see if I can. So, okay, my bandwidth is weird. I'm not gonna find the picture again. But so the collar actually does have clasps. If this is the collar, I don't know if you can see, then over here, like the battery pack is down here. This is around the neck. And then over here, there is a clasp, so to speak. And there are nuts and bolts that are holding it together. And over time, they will rust. And then eventually they'll break apart and the collar is going to fall off. As a second release mechanism for the collar, there's actually this tiny little explosive device. Yeah, it's nothing that will hurt the bear, but it will make sure that those nuts and bolts actually break and also make the collar fall off. So there are two different ways that we make sure that the collars will fall off. And I know it's hard to tell just from looking at the picture of a collar, but it's there.
So the moral of the story is that if you go to school for a long enough time, you get to like shoot polar bears with tranquilizer darts and helicopters with rifles and then put mini explosive collars on them. This is like the ultimate example of how cruel scientists are. Okay, let me go to Ms. Baniselda's class.
I want to point out that it's not like that.
Okay. Ms. Baniselda's class, Mississauga, if you guys want to come up, you don't need to type questions because we can hear you guys, hopefully. So come up and let's see if we can take a question live. You should be good to go. Oh, we still can't. Oh, so you're right. We can't hear you. So I will pass along your question in writing. You are demuted, so it's not working. So Thea, the question is, how much does a polar bear eat in a day?
So polar bears don't necessarily eat every day. But if you take a ring seal, which is basically one adult, like that would be me, which is a ring seal is 20 to 40% fat. A polar bear will eat a ring seal every week and a half. That is how much energy they need to stay healthy. Yeah, and it has to be seals because you don't really have anything else, any other prey available in the high Arctic that has the same amount of energy in it. So about a seal a week, yeah.
Cool. All right, we got a quick question from a class in Ottawa, Canada, Miss Rob Sea Turtle's classroom, and they wanted to ask, Aurora wanted to ask, what did you eat for food when you were up in the Arctic?
So many different dried meals. If you go to Mountain Equipment Canada, MEC, for example, and you go and look at all the pouches of dried food that you can buy there, it's a lot of that kind of food. And then a lot of canned food, tin food. Yeah. So, I mean, you really don't get any fresh vegetables, but you try and eat like, yeah, varied.
So you're heating up water on a stove and you're pouring the boiling water into like a pack of dried food and then you're mixing it up and eating it, correct? Lovely.
Yeah, it's very glamorous.
Yeah, oh yes, like the toilet. All right, I'm going to take a second question from a YouTube class before we dive back in with live groups. So Miss Peterson's class joining us, Miss Peterson's from McKay, Idaho, wanted to ask, what is the gestation period and how many babies do polar bears have?
So polar bears, this is a little bit technical, but bear with me. Polar bears have what is called delayed implantation. Yeah. So mating time is in the spring, let's say April-ish. And then, the male and the female will spend a week, maybe 2 weeks together and mate multiple times. But even if the egg is fertilized, it doesn't implant, it doesn't start growing. So it only implants in the fall around October, plus minus a month, around October. And that's also when the female goes into her maternity den. So those two things coincide. And then she gives birth to the cubs around New Year. So really their gestation period is only 3 to 4 months.
Very neat.
It's a very clever system.
And sorry,
Yeah.
how many babies do they have at a time?
Oh, well, on average 2, but the skinnier the bears become, the fewer cubs they have.
Okay, excellent. All right, let's go back to some live classes. Miss Rutkowski's class, if you guys have a question, go for it.
Hey.
Hi.
Do polar bears have scent glands on their feet? And if so, is that how females find the males?
Or the other way around?
Or the other way around?
That is such an awesome question. I can tell you guys have been doing your homework. Yeah, cool. So other bears have like rub trees, where they'll put their scent all over the tree to tell other bears who they are and, how old they are and whether they're looking for a mate and all of this. But where polar bears live, you don't usually have a lot of trees. So you're absolutely right. Instead of having rub trees, they have in between their toes, they have these scent glands. And every time they take a step on the snow and the ice, they will leave a little trace of their scent. And then the males in the springtime during mating season, they can then smell all the tracks that they're coming by and see which one belongs to a female that's adult and alone. And then they can follow that right track to get to that female. Yeah.
Very cool.
It's very cool.
I love when classes do research ahead of time. That's fantastic. All right, I'm going to go to Miss Pearson's class, Miss Hood's class, take a few more on YouTube, and then what we'll do, Thea, is that in our first presentation, you were willing to take some questions after the fact, and I know each of these classes has a ton of questions for you. So if we're able to do that again, that would be great.
I'm sure.
But we'll take like a few more here live. All right, I want to go to Miss Pearson's class. Come on up, guys. For it.
What's the biggest polar bear you've seen?
Whew, that's a great question. Honestly, there was one time I was in Churchill, which is in Hudson Bay in Canada, and I was out on the tundra and it was nighttime, but of course we had light inside the tundra buggy, which was where I was, inside this bus, if you will. And I remember looking out in the dark, and then all of a sudden I just saw this enormous bear just pass by and then just disappear into the darkness again. And honestly, it was so fast that I don't know, the exact size of him. I'm sure it was a him, but it was just enormous. So that's all I can tell you. I know that the biggest polar bear that we know of, he was 1,300 pounds. Which is quite a bit. Yeah.
It's like the weight of like all the kids in some of the smaller classes put together. So pretty impressive.
Yeah. That's true.
All right. You know what? I'm going to take 2 questions from Miss Hood's class. They're joining us for the first time today, and I love that sort of enthusiasm. And then I'll take a couple more from YouTube. And then for our teachers, write down the questions of your class. Send them to me in an email when we're done, and we can take more that way. But Miss Hood's class, come on up.
Okay, go ahead, Cecil. Say hi, I'm Cecil.
Hi, I'm Cecil.
Go ahead, ask your question.
How long would a polar bear be?
How long would it be? Yeah.
Yes.
How old?
How long, Thea?
So how long? Sorry. How long?
It's big.
It really depends on the bear.
Yeah.
Do you mean like when they're standing on their hind legs, they can be up to like 9 feet tall?
Wow. Yeah, that's fantastic. Exactly.
Yeah. So
Cool.
pretty big, but also, that's a big bear, right? And bears come in all sizes. But yeah, like that's the biggest one I know of.
The most incredible experience I ever had at a zoo was by a polar bear enclosure. And I turned away and I turned back and the bear had snuck up beside me. And I mean, even with, I knew I was safe, but through an inch of glass, seeing the size of this animal is incredible. If any of you ever get a chance to go to a zoo to see a polar bear in person, you should. It's incredible. All right. You know what? I'm going to go right back to Ms. Hood's class for a second question, take a couple on YouTube, and then we'll wrap up from there. Come on up, Ms. Hoods, guys.
Hi, I'm Lily.
Go ahead.
Do polar bears hibernate during the winter?
Do they hibernate?
During the winter, hibernate, yeah.
Right, okay. Sorry. So the quick answer is no. Polar bears don't hibernate. Most polar bears are out there on the sea ice in the darkness because, in the high Arctic, the winter is 24 hours of darkness every day. But they're out there on the sea ice, hunting seals, doing their thing, living their best life. However, the new moms, so the new family groups, like the pregnant moms and their newborn cubs, they will be in what we call a maternity den. They're not hibernating, but they're in this den because polar bear cubs are tiny when they're born. Like they'll fit in the palm of your hand, right? And because they're so small when they're born around January 1st, they're not ready to be out in this harsh Arctic environment. And that's why the female will be in the den with her cubs for their first 3 months of life while she's nursing them and they're getting a little bit bigger and with more fat and, they're learning to walk and all these things. So that's why she's in the den. But no polar bears really hibernate, no.
Yeah, cool question though, guys. All right, 2 more from YouTube before we go. So Miss Calaris's class, grade 5s in Medina, Ohio, wanted to ask, does the black marker on the back of the bear affect its ability to camouflage in any way?
It does not. The thing is that out on the sea ice, things aren't as white as a lot of people think. You remember the algae I was talking about in the beginning? When sea ice breaks up and kind of shifts, sometimes you see the underside of it and it's like dirty brown. So there's a lot of that if you get up into the sea ice in the spring particularly and summer. And also this black marker, it disappears usually after a few days to a couple of weeks.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah.
I was wondering that. I'm glad we got that question. All right, and to wrap up, just joining us a few minutes ago from Green River, Wyoming, Miss Matson's class wanted to ask, what have you found in your research? Are polar bears adapting to this changing sea ice conditions or not?
Right, that's a good question. We all wish that polar bears could just adapt and just become land-living polar bears instead of sea-living animals. But unfortunately, that's not true. Polar bears have evolved through thousands to millions of years to being specialized at living on the sea ice and eating seals. So even when they're forced to be on land, in Hudson Bay, for example, where the sea ice disappears completely every summer, and the bears are forced to be on land, they will eat kelp that's washed up on the shore. They'll eat some bird eggs. They'll eat like voles, like little mice. They'll eat grass even sometimes. So they'll eat whatever they can find. Even though they do that, we see that they still lose the same amount of body weight, and that's about 2 pounds per day, 2.2 pounds per day, that they lose in body weight, even though they're eating these other things that they can find on land. So really the only thing that is available to polar bears and to keep them healthy long-term are seals, like good, fat, blubbery seals. And in order to catch them, the polar bears need the sea ice. So unfortunately, we're not seeing any indications that bears can survive long-term without the sea ice and without the seals.
Right. Which is incentive to take action, guys. And I mean, this is something we're seeing with kids all around the world that are marching on behalf of climate change. It's been fantastic. So that sort of activism, that sort of enthusiasm for protecting some amazing animals like polar bears goes a long way. So keep doing that sort of thing and you'll make a big difference. Yeah, this has been fantastic.
I wanted to show you something, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's just that here, see, this is our webpage, yeah?
Yeah.
Polar Bears International. And if you go to get involved and you click that, if only mine would do it now. Anyway, if you click get involved, you get to this page. And here we have, like, it doesn't matter who you are or what you're doing. We have like listed initiatives that you can take and fun projects you can do with your friends. And yeah, there are like lesson plans for teachers and all kinds of neat things. Just showing you how you can take action and be a part of keeping polar bears and sea ice around.
Amazing.
Just wanted to tell you that.
I was going to ask, actually, at the end, I always ask our speakers if they can share ways that classes can get involved and do something, and you beat me to it. So I will pass along that link to all our classes, including the YouTube ones when we're done. And so thank you so much for this, Thea. This has been amazing. I know you've only done the one session with us, but what we do when we wrap up every session is I'm going to demute every class's microphones. And so boys and girls, if you guys get ready to join me in saying a huge thank you to Dr. Bechshoft for joining us today. You are all now, you should be all now, I'm doing it slowly but surely, demuted. And then you're good to go. Guys. And if that isn't fulfilling to start your day or end your day, I don't know what is. Thank you so much to all our classes. We really appreciate you guys tuning in. And do check out the Toronto Zoo session coming in soon. We're really excited about that and doing 2 polar bear sessions in 1 month. We're so excited about polar bears here. Dr. Bechshoft, thank you so much. Oh, what were you going to say? Oh, yeah.
I want to say a final thing. I want to say it's actually International Polar Bear Day on February 27th.
Okay.
And we have all kinds of awesome things going on and live chats and things where you can ask all your polar bear questions. So just go to our website and we'll tell you all about it.
Amazing. So save up those questions, guys, you didn't get to answer today. We'll make sure that they get answered somehow, some way. Thank you so much to everyone. Dr. Bechshoft, we really appreciate you joining us today from Denmark.